Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. Our approach with this podcast, the biographical approach, is not unique. Stories of educational life running counter to Zionism and Jewish folks engaging work to constantly struggle and study to act in solidarity with Palestinian liberation scatter history and present. Today's guest, Alison Glick, a writer and activist based in Philadelphia, offers one such piece in her beautiful novel, The Other End of the Sea. And she shares a lot of that story on today's episode, but her story is certainly not just hers. In the episode that you're about to hear, Alison talks about the many ways that we make and remake family, the ways that we hold on to people and place, how and why in these impossible times we continue. So here's my conversation with Alison Glick. Alison Glick, welcome to Another Education is Possible. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here, Jordan. Thanks very much.
We're recording on a very warm, maybe not even spring day, a summery day here in Philadelphia. We are also recording at a very difficult time, on top of 17 months of a difficult time. I'm excited to hear this very complex and deep story that you're going to share with us. And maybe we can start all the way at the beginning. So what did Israel and Zionism and Palestine look like for you?
Growing up, I wasn't really learning very much about those things, actually. I'm from a quote unquote mixed marriage, a mixed family. My father was Jewish. My mother was not. She was Christian. And they actually eloped to be married after my father returned from fighting in World War II because my maternal grandmother did not want my mother marrying a Jew. So they got married in Kentucky. I'm originally from Cincinnati, which is right on the Mason-Dixon line, and so crossed the river where the marriage laws were a little more lax, and came back to Cincinnati and lived initially with my father's family, most of whom were Russian and Yiddish-speaking immigrants. My grandmother and grandfather were actually cousins, which was not unusual in that culture at that time. And my great-grandfather and his brother had married sisters. So my 19-year-old mother was coming into this family that had mostly known each other, most if not all of their lives. And her family had migrated from Appalachia, from eastern Kentucky, to Cincinnati, of course, for jobs, like most migrants were doing at the time, and of course since then. And my grandmother and grandfather spoke English, but most of the rest of the family didn't speak much English. So here's my mother thrown into this family, most of whom could not communicate with her. So she had to figure out how to communicate with them, which mostly happened through food and cooking. My mother became this great Eastern European Jewish cook. And, the kugel and matzo ball recipes have come down through my mother, who began to refer to herself as the Jewish hillbilly. In fact, one of the most vivid memories I have is of my mother setting up this hand-cranked meat grinder on an ironing board in our living room to make knishes, which I have never done and will never do. And her telling me about my great-grandmother who was blind, making challah before sundown on Friday and braiding within seconds this perfect loaf of challah, and just like watching this woman who couldn't see do this. But so these are some of the memories and the family lore that was handed down. But she did not convert to Judaism, even though most of them kept a kosher home, and they just accepted her unconditionally and loved her unconditionally. In fact, I recently remembered that I had this diary that my mother kept between 1944 and 1946. It was kind of amazing. I mean, she was writing in it, and would, at the top of one page, she wrote, I remember, Germany invaded Russia. And I went shopping for a dress with mother today. I mean, it was just like, oh my God. But tucked inside the diary were love letters my father was sending her from basic training, and then when he was stationed in the Pacific. And I could infer from his response that she had been arguing with her parents about their relationship. And her father, whom I never met, was an abusive alcoholic. So, things were tough for her. But he said to her at one point, you can go to my family anytime, that they will welcome you. And this is before they were married. He was still, in the war. They didn't marry until afterwards. And when I read that, I just burst into tears, because and that was just, a few weeks ago. I just thought, oh my God, that sense of openness and welcoming was just very, very touching. So, although I didn't have a formal Jewish education really of any kind growing up, the closest thing we had to Jewish ritual or tradition was my grandfather giving us Hanukkah gelt. And almost the only time, I think the one of two times I've been in a synagogue, was when I was 19 to say Kaddish for him after he died. I came to identify Judaism and Jews with this humane, caring, kind of crazy family. Not that anyone told me this is what Jews do, or this is how Jews act. It was just this sort of organic identification and absorption of a kind of ethos of, these were who these people were, and this is the way they acted. How did I learn? I learned through probably the most powerful educational experience you have available, which is experiencing these things and living these things, especially, I think, at a young age. And I think it's important, though, to know or to note that it's not that these people were saints. I learned later that, my grandfather and grandmother were not exactly caring, loving parents to my father and his sister, or frankly, to each other. They were complex, imperfect, problematic on many levels, but the way that they treated my mother, and then eventually us kids, was instructive on a level that I think it took me a while to understand. But none of this had to do with the state of Israel. It wasn't mentioned. And of course, nobody, I'm sure, knew what or who, Palestine was, right? Which of course makes a lot of sense, because why would they know about Israel? I mean, this was not part of their reality. But it's only much later, I think, that Judaism and Zionism have come to be conflated, as has been noted by others, for very nefarious purposes. But that was not the type of family that I grew up in.
Yeah. There's nothing more Jewish in terms of education than eating a kugel,
That's right.
than
You got
hearing
it.
than hearing stories of how your grandmother made a challah for the Shabbos, and you're really touching on something very, not to play host educator person, but you're really touching on something very well documented, which is the shift towards Zionism in the United States, which took place in the late, post 1967. And you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about times that, precede that. If there's this beautiful diary from literally before the state of Israel existed,
Exactly.
it's not going to include any form of Zionism because it was this vague concept that certainly had taken hold, but there was a large push throughout the 20th century, but it's not something that would concern the vast majority of Jews in the U.S. And yet, that's a direction towards which you turn. So, where did that start to take place?
Well, as I grew older, entered high school, even before high school, I had this interest in traveling. And I don't know where I got it from because no one in my family, except my father, who fought in the Pacific, had been abroad, unless you count when we crossed the Windsor Bridge into Canada for, a half hour when we were visiting my aunt in Detroit. Um, no one had been abroad. No one had a passport in my family, but I somehow acquired this interest. So in high school, I joined the International Exchange Student Club. I was primarily interested in going to Spain because I was studying Spanish, but you had to put a second choice. And I put Israel as my second choice, as a 16, 17-year-old, because as you were alluding to, I had already sort of absorbed enough of this like post 1967 war shift in terms of the United States support for Israel, which really just took off after the 67 war. And part of that was, of course, identifying it as the Jewish state. So because I didn't know any better, I thought, oh, if I'm interested in exploring my Jewish heritage, which I was vaguely, I should maybe go to Israel. And it was where I thought I needed to go if I were to go anywhere to do that. But it was still my second choice, right? It was this vaguely formed and obviously uninformed idea. And as things would have it, and as we often do in life, I got my second choice. So in the summer of 1980, off I went to Israel. And it was especially for this kind of working class kid growing up in the suburbs of Cincinnati, this idyllic experience, living with this Israeli family a few blocks from the Mediterranean and hitchhiking throughout the country with my host sister. Before that, I spent 2 weeks on a kibbutz outside of Jerusalem, picking peaches at 5 a.m., which was not so idyllic, but it was just something like I'd never experienced before, of course, given my family history and growing up where I did. So, and the family I lived with was this Ashkenazi family, working class, just in this little town south of Haifa called Kiryat Yam. The father was a Holocaust survivor. The mother may have been too. I don't remember exactly. And Labor Party supporters. It felt in a way like home in terms of like the same social class, but of course a very different environment, literally. And one thing I noted but didn't really process until much later was the mother, both parents worked, and the mother worked in the industrial sector of Haifa in a factory or something. I don't quite remember. And one day she would come home from work around midday and start cooking lunch. And one day she was complaining to me about how hot and like dirty she was coming home after work. We lived in this like fourth floor walk up. And she said to me one day, there are showers at work, but I don't like to use them because the Arabs use them. And I was stunned. I mean, I'm not a red diaper baby. I did not really have a political education growing up. I mean, my family were Democrats, but you know, that was about it. But I knew, and like, oh God, that was a horrible thing. What did I just hear? What does that mean? I don't want to think about it. And I just kind of let it go. And the friends I made that summer, I'd also heard some pretty horrible things said about Arabs. I could make comparisons to what people would say about Black people in this country, for example. But I was 17 and I was just letting it go because I didn't want to think about it. But there it was somewhere in my brain. So I returned to Cincinnati and was completely alienated from my peers. And then a few months later, my father was diagnosed with late stage prostate cancer, which was a total shock, of course. That only exacerbated this sense of alienation. And all I could think about was going back to Israel. So I began to plan for that. I was going to postpone college. This was way before, things like birthright. But I had found my way to the local Jewish community center and found out about these programs where you could go and study Hebrew and work on a kibbutz and maybe immigrate to Israel, right? And so that's what I did. And that's what I planned to do. My father's health, of course, was deteriorating rapidly. And at one point, I realized I can't just leave. So I told my mother, I don't know, late spring that year or the next year, I think I need to not go on this trip. And at some point, she told my father, who was in the hospital before he came home, where he died, and he told her to tell me that I should go. And my father was not the type of person who took an interest in our activities or what we were interested in or anything. So the fact that my father said that to my mother was meaningful in a way that, again, I couldn't quite articulate at the time. But in a way, and not that it was intended as such, became a gift to me because I did end up going just a couple weeks after he died in late August of 1981. And that changed my life forever, really, because of the experiences I had, what I learned as a result of that trip. So it was Israel, kind of the concept or the idea of Israel filling this void for someone who thought this was how she wanted to explore her Jewish roots, when in fact it became something very, very different.
It sounds like there's this real balance of belonging and inclusion happening, that Israel for you felt like a site of adventure and exploration and getting out of your small town, but also perhaps the Jewish community of Cincinnati was not a place where you belonged, but Israel was a place where you belonged. Is that accurate?
Yes, 100%. I mean, the we were not part of the Jewish community in Cincinnati. The Jewish part of town, or the part of town that we identified as Jewish, was much wealthier. The closest thing we got to it was when my grandfather have my mother drive him, because he didn't drive, to a deli on that part of town where he would buy schmaltz when he wanted to make matzo ball soup.
So then we're in the early 1980s.
Yes.
You're mourning, you're in the middle of loss and grief, and you go back with, was the intention to make Aliyah?
That was a possibility. I don't, it was like,
Yeah.
okay, maybe, let me think about this. I certainly made inquiries about it before and while I was there. I was studying Hebrew. I was on this kibbutz in this program called an ulpan that was specifically designed to teach new Jewish immigrants Hebrew, to kind of absorb them in the culture. But when I got there, more surprises were in store for me. I mean, I landed on this kibbutz, again, not far from Haifa, overlooking the Mediterranean, gorgeous, beautiful scenery, and started hanging out with these lefty Europeans and Americans who, were saying all these critical things about Israel and the West, which I found interesting. And I mostly listened because, again, I didn't have a sophisticated political way of framing what I was experiencing or seeing. I remember the one woman whom I was closest to was part of she was British. I think it was called the Women's Strike for Peace in the Greenwich Army base. Or anyway, they were involved in protests and strikes, just so I thought, oh gosh, this is so cool. I'm going to hang with them. One of the first things I noticed, though, was there was a new dormitory being built on the kibbutz in the section where the foreign Jews were living. And it was being built by Palestinians. And despite, the quote unquote socialist egalitarian kibbutz, I was living on, those Arab laborers, Palestinian laborers did not eat in the dining room. They did not talk to us. We were kind of told, you don't really go there. And they literally slept in the shell of the building that they were building, which for, laborers to do, I mean, that's something that happens in a lot of places. And then I remember they would go home on Friday and come back by Sunday, because we wouldn't see them there Friday going into Saturday. And I thought, that's odd. Shouldn't they be eating in the dining room? Why do we have to avoid them? I mean, obviously, I was beginning to absorb that you are to fear and avoid Arabs. The word Palestinian wasn't used because they're dangerous, right? So, but then the kibbutz, again, labor, egalitarian, liberal, whatever, had these programs for us. And one of them was a lecture by a Palestinian citizen of the state from a village inside Israel, a Palestinian village inside Israel. It was called Life as an Arab in Israel. And this man, who was a teacher from a village called Shva Amr, came and talked and invited whoever wanted to at the end to visit his village. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. I went and talked to him. I got directions to the village, which involved taking a couple buses and a taxi. And I don't know, it was not a sort of straightforward journey. And then I began asking these lefties I was hanging out with, do you want to come with me? Let's go together. No one wanted to go. No one. And can remember these uncomfortable looks I got, but no one said anything to me. And I went. And when I arrived in the village, I was completely shocked because what I saw, I could only identify as what the Jim Crow South must have looked like. And when I compared it to the town I had been living in with the Jewish family the summer before, this very modern accommodations, electricity, the school was top notch. When I compared it to this village school, which was, and I remember the desks were kind of half in the classroom where I visited, kind of a lot of them were broken. The road leading into the village was just pockmarked, full of holes, and it was just a real shock. And of course, I did not have terminology like apartheid, let alone colonialism at the time, but I knew what I was seeing, and that was something very different from what I had been told up to that point, which was this is the only democracy in the Middle East and everybody is equal. And it was shocking and appalling. And I didn't still quite know what to make of all of that. But I can remember the feeling I felt when I saw it. And I knew that it was wrong. I had met one of the teacher's students. He had taken my address at the kibbutz, and a few weeks later, I got this slip of paper in my kibbutz mailbox, which was, you have to come and sign for this envelope or package at the kibbutz post office. Of course, in my naivete, I thought, oh, my mother had sent me a package, and I have to go sign for it. Well, what it was a letter from this young man, and I had to sign for it because it was from a Palestinian village, an Arab village. And I knew that without somebody telling me. And I was pissed because somehow when I opened that letter, and I can still see that letter in my mind's eye to this day, I don't remember anything it said, but he had hand-drawn flowers around the edge of the paper. But this was a security threat. I had to go sign for it and kind of explain myself. And that hypocrisy and it's just hypocrisy. Somehow it kind of brought it all together in this way that was emotional, not intellectual. And I was just really pissed. And I thought, what is really going on here? So that experience ended. I did not make Aliyah. I came back to the United States, started college, and a few months later, the Israelis invaded Lebanon in June of 1982. And the siege of Lebanon happened, the Sabra and Shatila massacre happened, which the Israelis were essentially responsible for. And I started hanging out with international students. I met a Palestinian woman who became a good friend, and she started giving me books by Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, and my political world opened up and changed 180 degrees. I went from being this sort of young Zionist who didn't really even quite know what that meant, but had this emotional attachment to someone who began to understand the history and the politics and what that meant, both for me personally and my values, but also what it meant for its victims. And that was literally life-changing. And when I think about what that meant and how it connects to my family history that we were just discussing, I see how I was kind of prepared to take in, or to take, I was prepared to see and take in what I eventually saw, is what I'm trying to say, in ways that, again, took me a while to understand, because in my household, everyone was welcome. I'm the second youngest of six. My older brother and sisters began bringing home Black friends and gay friends. I mean, this is in the 70s, right? I eventually started bringing home international student friends, and everybody was just welcome in our household. It wasn't, no one even thought about it. I mean, it was like DEI before DEI was a thing. And no other family that I could see around me was like that. And I didn't think about that difference at the time. But when I think about what I experienced and what I was able to make of it, I know that that upbringing, that, again, that powerful educational tool of that experience prepared me for that, and in many ways. So there is that connection. My Jewish family essentially gave refuge to my mother and my parents' relationship. And I guess I kind of think of it in a slightly cheesy way of their, I'm sure unconsciously, sort of paying it forward.
I love that image of family so much. Of just, I'm an only child and have kind of a very
Mm,
small family, but I love hearing the just the open. A home is the people who come through the door and the many people who are welcome into your house and coming together over a dinner table. I'm probably putting something that isn't there together, but I'm drawn back to your grandmother, and I'm wondering if this is a moment of almost the braiding of the threads of a challah, that this emotional
yeah.
rage, this kind of intellectual education encountering Saeed, and your family upbringing are all, these threads are all interweaving in this moment and coming together for a particular purpose. And so I'm wondering then, where does that lead?
Yeah. Well, I love that image. I never thought of that. Um, uh, if I continue to write about that, I'm probably going to steal it.
Please
So
do. Yep.
I will credit you. Yeah, I mean, I started at the University of Cincinnati, but quickly transferred to Temple to study with a Middle East historian there. And thank God that I did. Yeah, I think another thing that I would say, though, is that these family stories, this family lore that I heard growing up, actually later in my life as an adult, helped me to also understand more of what was going on in terms of my what came to be my identification with and work for social justice, particularly in terms of Palestinian liberation. But before it became that, a couple stories that I'll share. So when my parents eloped and they were on their honeymoon, they stopped in this diner somewhere in the South, although, of course, it could have happened anywhere in the United States. My father was in his Marine uniform with his Purple Heart pinned to his chest because he had been wounded on Iwo Jima. And they come up to the counter and sit at the counter. My father always loved to sit at the counter and not like in a booth, because he loved to see who was going and coming. And that was all his life. He was a people person in many ways. And at one point, a Black man came in and came up to the counter and just asked for a glass of water. And the guy behind the counter said, "Get out of here, you N-word." And my father stood up. He was, this kind of big barrel chested guy, handed the man his glass of water, and looked at the guy behind the counter and said, "What are you going to do about it?" And the man drank the water and I'm sure got out of there as quickly as he could. But my mother told me this story years later, and I couldn't believe it. Because again, my father was not, the kumbaya, let's all hold hands and, sing together kind of guy. It just, there was something in some ways so out of character for him. But then when I think about it, of course he would do that. My brother was the only male out of 6 children. And he was not the kind of he was not the physical sports type. He was into theater. A bit of a disappointment to my father during the 70s, the long hair, listened to rock music, kind of counterculture person kind of guy. And my father wanted him to join the army to make a man out of him, to use that, cliche. And this was during the Vietnam War. And I learned later that, he ended up not being drafted because the war eventually ended. But my mother was planning on taking him and going to Canada. If my father pushed this or if he got drafted, what was going to happen to the 5 girls? I don't know. But I was like, really? I just could not imagine my mother doing this. Until the 70s recession, she didn't know how to drive. And she would say, I left the house twice during the week. Once to take out the garbage, and the second time when your father drove me to the grocery store. And then when the 70s recession hit, she learned how to drive and got a job in a department store, and, life changed. But that was another story. So the fact that she had this plan to take my brother to Canada to escape the Vietnam War, which she thought was wrong, was quite the insight. You learn these things way too late in life. But to me, this was also part of this braiding, right? Not, again, a sophisticated political or philosophical understanding of what social justice was, but living it in a imperfect, complex, and struggling family. And that was my educational inheritance. Thank God.
What about as you're finishing up college and you're kind of these different threads are coalescing?
Well, my formal education, particularly at Temple, unlearning Zionism, or frankly, learning what it actually is.
I love that framing.
Yeah. Led me to, as I mentioned earlier, this completely different political point of view. I became an anti-Zionist, but I wanted very much to return to Palestine. And I knew now that it was Palestine, and studied Middle East history. I thought maybe eventually I would be a journalist. But all I knew was that I wanted to go back. And this time I wanted to live, of course, in the Palestinian sector, which I did. As soon as I graduated from college, I went to Ramallah and got a job teaching at the Friends School right before the First Intifada broke out, and ended up doing human rights work in Gaza when the Intifada broke out and our school was closed down. And eventually ended up marrying a Palestinian from Gaza who ended up in exile, so ended up living 3 years in Syria as well. So this journey that started, well, initially, of course, as a foreign exchange student, getting my second choice of Israel, and then going back to explore my quote unquote Jewish roots in this place, became dedicating most of my adult life to thinking about, studying about, writing about, and working on behalf of Palestinian rights and liberation. And sorry, having this other emotional tie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that time, which I would imagine is um, full of so much, opening up new worlds and um, living through the First Intifada. Um, were you a writer already at this time?
I'd always loved writing. I was always, good at it, whatever that means. Fortunately, became, I think, a bit better. And I wasn't writing initially, I was teaching. When living in Syria, I was doing freelance writing. And when I came back to the United States, was interested in continuing writing just personally for my own personal benefit, really, because it was a way of processing, and it was a creative outlet for me, and the one that I always knew I had available, but wasn't quite sure, I guess, what to do with. I mean, I will say very briefly, perhaps. I mean, we can talk more about it if you'd like, but living through the First Intifada was amazing. Seeing people take control of their lives and their history at a very grassroots level, which is what the First Intifada was exhilarating and a history lesson in and of itself. And one writing project that sort of got put on hold by the current circumstances, as well as just the difficulties inherent in doing it, I was hoping with a former student of mine at the French school and a former teacher there who became a Middle East professor. We wanted to do an oral history of the First Intifada and started it, but weren't able to really continue with it because I realized when somebody pointed it out to me that a lot of younger Palestinians, I mean maybe under 40, don't really know much at all about the First Intifada, which is truly, a loss on so many levels, and was kind of shocking. So we thought an oral history project would, not that it's up to us to, as foreigners, to recover or uncover Palestinian history for them, but we wanted to work with our former student who still lives in Palestine so that we could support him and people he was working with to record and to bring it not only to them but to bring it to the West. I mean, we wanted to do it so that it could be translated or initially recorded when possible in English, because there seems to be no memory of it here in the United States either, at least in the mainstream press. Or and I mean, it was just a very important time where people worked together in a sense of collective liberation, led by each other, not led by any one individual or individuals. Yeah, it's just an important learning tool.
Yeah. I would argue similarly that the West doesn't have to be involved here, but we do have to deal with our own shit. And I think the collective memory of the West frames it as this just terrorist implementation of like doing something to innocent little Israel that
Yeah.
without understanding any notion of not only what actually happened, and well, I won't go into the rabbit
Yeah.
hole of complaining about how people in the U.S. largely understand the Intifada and the way that people run scared from the calls for marches for an Intifada or globalizing an
Right.
Intifada. But that sounds like a beautiful project, and I hope that it can come to fruition.
Yeah. It, I hope so too. I hope so too.
So then, eventually a lot of these experiences ended up in your book, The Other End of the Sea. I'm wondering how it came together. And since this is a podcast about education, I wonder if there's some kind of difference. You wrote it as a memoir and at some point realized that perhaps a fictionalized version, writing a novel was more appropriate, or simply what ended up happening. So I'm wondering what the kind of the pedagogy of a novel versus a memoir is. And
Yeah. I mean, to pick up the thread about writing that we started earlier, when I came back to the US, had this notion that I wanted to continue to write, but just establishing or reestablishing myself as an adult in the United States, really for the first time. I mean, I left for Palestine in 1986 and returned in 1992. I mean, I'd been a student up until that time, and suddenly I came back and I had to learn about things like 401ks and health insurance and taxes. And so once I kind of learned all that, I think I'm still learning about some of those things. I began taking writing workshops and doing little pieces, essays, etc. And I really did not want to write about the Middle East. I think I was, in fact, kind of consciously or maybe subconsciously avoiding writing about it because I didn't want to deal with a lot of the things that I had experienced. I think there was some trauma there. But every time I would write just about, somehow it came back to that. And eventually I moved to the DC area for a while and was taking an essay writing workshop at the Bethesda Writers Center and wrote this, what I thought was an essay. And it was about an experience I had in Gaza, actually. And in this really snide, kind of dismissive voice, the teacher said to me, I don't know what this is. It's not an essay. I think it's part of a book chapter, and I think you should need to write a book. And not a
okay.
pedagogical approach I would recommend.
And yet the outcome.
And yet the
Yeah.
outcome was quite effective.
Yeah.
So um, when I kind of got over that, I looked into the next term's offerings at the Writers Center, and lo and behold, a course that was being offered was literally entitled Writing the First Chapter of Your Memoir. And I thought, okay, maybe I need to start believing in God because this is too good. So I signed up for the course, and about 2 days before it was meant to start, I got a call from the center saying, sorry, low enrollment, we're canceling the course. And I was crushed, but undeterred, as they say. And I said, can you give me the name of and contact information of the teacher? Because I'd like to get in touch with him. And they did. And I told the guy my story. I worked out this deal with him that we would meet once a week or so, and for what I came to understand was a really discounted rate because I was unemployed at the time. This man started working with me. And by that time, I had come to understand that I needed to write a book. Of course, I really had no idea how to go about doing that because I'd never done it. He had just published his own memoir. He was an Iowa MFA. He didn't really know anything about the Middle East, but as I began sharing my writing with him about my experience living those 6+ years in Palestine, before that, in 48 Palestine/Israel, he understood how to help me do that. He understood that the book had to have a through line. And the through line was this relationship between the man I ended up marrying, a Palestinian from Gaza. And off of it, I would hang both of our backstories. The backstory of myself, I've just discussed with you, and his backstory as a family, growing up in a family of refugees in Shati camp in Gaza, having been driven out of their village of Ashdod, which is now called Ashdod, just north of Gaza. And the family that we eventually became, which, spoiler alert, I guess, kind of fell apart as a nuclear family unit, but came back together in a different way, but one that is equally full of love and care, especially now, because they are all, that side of our family are all in Gaza. And so he understood what I wanted to do and helped me to do it. And when I finally had a finished manuscript as a memoir, I was shopping it around for publication. I couldn't get an agent, but I realized that there were publishers that took unrepresented manuscripts. And so I eventually submitted it to Interlink Press, and they said yes and gave me a contract. And my manuscript was assigned to an editor who read it and called me up one day and said, your writing style is very literary, and I think you should think about making this a novel. At which point I completely freaked out, because I was certainly not a fiction writer, I told myself. I think he knew I was going to freak out and was prepared and helped me to go through this process, assuring me that I did not have to completely rewrite the book, that it was really because of my style of writing. I needed to identify places in the manuscript, scenes, characters, etc., in the manuscript that I could amplify in a way that did not have to adhere to nonfiction, that would make it a book that was probably going to be read by more people, because his contention was that a book about this issue, i.e., Palestine and Zionism and colonialism and apartheid, hard topics for people to read about, would find a broader readership as a novel. And I think he was right. I remember telling a nonfiction writer, a friend of mine, this theory, and he said, no, you need to look at the statistics. More nonfiction books are sold in the country than fiction. But I think what he wasn't taking into account was the issue. And like in so many other realms, this issue is somehow different. And apart from which, the process of fictionalizing it, of finding those places that I could create a broader and fuller narrative, create characters, create scenes, it actually made it, I believe, a better book. And I do think it's more accessible. And in terms of the pedagogical potential, I think particularly on this issue, that's important, that it can be, a pedagogical tool as a novel for people who don't know much about this issue or think they know something, but maybe they don't, or who are feel like, oh, it's quote unquote too complicated. Well, when it's told through the lens of a love story, because who doesn't like a love story, it becomes suddenly accessible. And it's not, although much of it is in reality, it's not quote unquote my story. It's a love story. It's a story about a family, about, say, a broken family that it actually puts itself back together in a very different way. Something that, frankly, many people have faced, right? I mean, it offers, because I did keep the first person, a certain sense of intimacy, I think, that, again, opens a door. So that's how it happened. I never would have done it without that encouragement. Never would have done it. And I, in fact, have, gone on to write a short story, actually about my Jewish side of my family, because, yeah, just about my grandmother ended up, as an aside, ended up converting to Christianity at one point. So it was this fictionalized account of why did she do that? I had no idea why she did that. But anyway, it broadened my perspective of myself as a writer and allowed me to think more deeply about how this story could be shared.
It's so funny in preparing for this interview, I read a few of the reviews of your book, and there was I don't know if you read your reviews, but there was a glowing review in the Times of Israel,
Yeah.
that I can't remember it exactly. It's been a couple weeks since I read it, but it was essentially like Israel starts as being portrayed in this bad way, and it only gets worse from there. Anyway, the love story persists, and it's like they frame it as like a Romeo and Juliet story, and I'm like, wow, there is something about how you craft the story that invites in people to learn, and it's not like you're hiding a message. There's a very genuine story about a family. It's a very genuine story about Palestine, but it does offer this entry point. Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember reading that. Yeah, I think yeah, it was funny reading that. Yeah, one of the helpful hints my editor gave me in terms of this fictionalization process, which I love to share because I think it's funny and maybe instructive. He said, anytime you come across a section in the memoir that reads like a human rights report, take it out.
Mm.
And, I mean, I'm all for human rights reports. Don't get me wrong. I did human rights research in Gaza, but yeah, it was, the goal was to be on human rights report. Like,
I'm interested then in how this connects because we came to know each other through your teach-in series. I know you're involved, which is very directly connected with We Are Not Numbers. I'm interested in how these threads connect, and if not, just hearing a bit about your work as somebody organizing these different events and what does it offer to do a teach-in series on Palestine?
yeah.
What does it mean to be involved in We Are Not Numbers?
Yeah. Again, We Are Not Numbers, for those who don't know, is an organization that was started to connect um, writers who in the West, primarily America, but not solely, with young writers in Gaza. I think it's a brilliant, brilliant project and has really grown. Just in the interest of full disclosure, I haven't been a mentor for a while. I was for a while and then was helping with fundraising. And then, yeah, after the genocide started, I had to focus on other things, including supporting my family there. But I think the brilliance of We Are Not Numbers, as the name implies, it was started after the 2014 I believe, attack on Gaza, because so many in the West know of Gaza and Gazans in terms of numbers, particularly the numbers killed, the numbers wounded, the nameless, faceless brown mass, right? That we're responsible for ethnically cleansing and murdering as U.S. taxpayers. And so it is a platform to encourage them to write about their experiences and to bring that writing to Western audiences because they're writing in English. So it's allowing them to give us their voice, which we very rarely hear, and to give us their stories. I love, of course, the Arundhati Roy quote that is on their website, which hopefully I will relay somewhat accurately, which is, "There's no such thing as the voiceless. There are those whose voices are preferably unheard," something like that. And this is meant as an antidote to that. So to me, We're Not Numbers is the quintessential Gaza. Gaza is a character in itself. In my book, Gaza is a character. And this organization, I think, represents the talent, the creativity, the perseverance, the strength of so many people in Gaza, despite, or maybe because of, the situation they live in. Not that that makes it okay, obviously, just because they're resilient, which they are. That does not mean that they can endure anything, because they can't. But it really showcases this talent and creativity that nobody hears about, nobody knows about. I mean, how many of us, when you hear the word Gaza, think of short story writers or poets or journalists? Well, maybe now they think of journalists, but not in the way we want them to. So that is We Are Not Numbers. And the speaker series is called Palestine as a Portal. And it really grew out of initially a friendship and an idea initially that I had, not the series idea, that was actually someone else's. But in September 2024, I came back to Philly after being away for the summer, or most of the summer. And it was so clear everybody was exhausted. It was almost a year of genocide. Millions of people had been in the street in this country and across the world, putting everything on the line. The encampments had been crushed, and the billions from Biden were flowing still, unfettered. And you could see the exhaustion and the demoralization. And I thought, well, one way to counter that is just for people to gather. And initially, I approached this friend of mine and said, let's just start asking people over to our houses. Frankly, my thought would be women, but wasn't going to be exclusive, to talk, to share food, to eat, to drink coffee, to do what people do when they get together, just so people can connect with each other, that we're not alone in our isolation and in our horror. And so we started doing that. We did that a couple times until the end of the year. And then she approached me, and she had this connection to the venue that we started using. And she said, will you help me organize a speaker series? Because we can get this venue for 6 weeks for free. Let's do it. And I immediately said yes, because again, the encampments had been crushed. Of course, suppression of speech about Palestine, which has been ongoing for many, many years, but has only escalated with the genocide, was, just full throttle. And one of the most beautiful things I found about the encampments was they were alternative spaces for education and for learning, from the Rafa de la Riera libraries to the teach-ins to, I remember I visited the encampment at George Washington in DC in the spring, and they were doing like Irish history teach-ins because of course you would in a Palestine encampment. And I had no idea how we would pull it together so quickly, but we did. I mean, just using our contacts. And it was really important that we not allow this suppression to silence us and to especially quash learning. Because when I think about all of the things that I've done in my life, there's always been some educational element to it. I mean, obviously, I was a teacher, as I mentioned. I worked in higher education, and I often would do trainings. Even I did a stint in the corporate world, and I was educating and training people about immigration law. I mean, it was, I work in a school now, but not as a teacher. So that's somehow always been a part of my life. My father was a teacher. I don't think I mentioned that. My mother and my grandmother were training to be teachers at this little teachers college in the South, but they both left that to get married. So that was just part of who I was and became. In my work with JVP, I was always doing educational stuff in one form or another. So this seemed like just a natural thing to do, as well as mentoring young writers in Gaza with We Are Not Numbers. So Palestine is a portal, is a way for people to connect, a way for people to maybe start building community, and a way for people to keep learning. Because if we don't keep learning, if we don't keep connecting, we're lost. I mean, anything that you read about how to face what we're facing with the rise of fascism is do not be isolated, do not be isolated. And so there's very much a part of that. That's very much a part of the thinking, is for people to have a way to not be isolated.
And to not be quiet, I think.
And to not be quiet.
Yeah. Those
Never.
are the two of the core principles of fighting fascism.
Yeah,
Speak,
100%.
connect. I love hearing that this partially emerged from the encampments because we're going to do an encampment episode, but I have constantly been teasing out the idea of that is the education that I've always wanted to make, and just kind of being on the outskirts of a couple of encampments to see everything that you mentioned, including and additionally cultural practices of many different kinds thriving, and just experiments in how to live together, how to doing
Yeah.
the educational work of how do we make decisions? How do we make the space work? If you're going to build a Rifat al-Ahrir library, how are you going to? There's not a library already there. There's nobody who comes in with funding and says, follow these steps. The real education
Yeah.
comes in the figuring it out. And that is so beautiful to see it. Some of course, the way they were crushed is devastating, but to see that the idea and the possibility of the encampments continue in a space like your teaching series.
Yeah. And I have to say, young people are so much better at doing that
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
people of my generation. I'm 62 years old, and I have learned so much from, people your undergraduates age or my daughter's age. They just are so much wiser than than I was. I mean, you're much younger than I am. It's it's so heartening, and they're not stopping.
No.
I mean, I think for reasons that would probably be another podcast episode, because they see their future. They've experienced their future in the 2008 crash, in the in COVID and a genocide and environmental and climate collapse. I mean, yeah, they're so, I mean, not to, I know it's not an easy task, but and I use this word advisedly because it does sound a bit like a trope, but they're really inspiring. My God. I mean, the morning that I woke up and a family member had sent me a video that I think has kind of gone viral. This tent city in Rafah of people who had been displaced by the genocide, writing on the sides of their tents, "Thank you, students," and doing this dance to honor them.
Yeah.
It was amazing. I mean, people need to know the power of coming together in these ways for all of us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing.
This is a space of possibility and hope, and I don't want to end on a kind of questioning and negative note necessarily, but I do wonder what it looks like for you now because I get very frustrated. It seems very self-centered when I see these quote unquote anti-Zionist Jews in the US asking this question of like, what does it mean to be an activist and what does it mean to be Jewish in the wake of the destruction of Gaza? Not going to get into Peter Beinart's book, but that broad question of like, what do we do in this moment? How do we? And it's like, well, one, you stop centering yourselves. But I do wonder that about you because I think that you're writing, I'd actually encountered your writing before then we formally met through the
Mm-hmm.
teaching series, as you mentioned, to connect the Mondo Vice piece that you wrote is instructive. It's moving. And I wonder what you do in this moment with your writing, or if you feel like that just needs to be left to the side
Mm.
and it's more these specific organizing events.
I am continuing to write sort of in fits and starts because um, sometimes it's just too hard to think about, and I can't write about anything else except Gaza. But I just this month finished another essay I'm trying to publish, which connects my time living in Gaza in the late 1980s to a visit I made to Gaza with our daughter to in July of 2023, 3 months before the genocide started. I hadn't been to Gaza for 31 years. And, you know, I write about the change that I saw in that place that I love so much before October 7th, 2023, and trying to make sense out of that. And the experience of looking back and making these new memories, seeing this old place through new eyes, through lack of a better term, and then knowing now, of course, what was coming. And teasing out, if you will, or writing through what is the essence of a place that now nobody recognizes. I mean, I didn't recognize it in July of 2023 for very different reasons. Now it's unrecognizable to all. So what's left? And what's left, of course, are the people that you love. And in the end, that's what it's all about, right? And So writing about that, I had taken notes during our trip and afterwards that summer because I knew sometime that I was going to write about it. But just like the book, it took a while because it was too painful and too much. But the right circumstances, I'll just say, presented themselves, and and I wrote it. And I think it also wasn't by accident that it happened at the time of organizing the Palestine as a Portal series, because what is that all about? It's about connecting people to each other and continuing to learn and think about this moment that we're in and what brought us here. I wish I was the type of person who got up and could write for hours every day. I mean, I have a day job, so that's not possible, but it does seem to come sort of in fits and starts, and I make notes and I set them aside. And then somehow it seems like the right time. That and reading, and yeah, talking to people about this is part of the process, the meaningful part of it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
Deep breath, everybody. Take a deep breath.
thank you so much for listening today. Today's show was produced by Yardain Amran, Samantha Haley, and me. If you like our podcast, please like us, subscribe, rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. We're also on Instagram at AnotherEdIsPossible. As always, we're continuing to generate support for Gaza Mutual Aid campaigns. Alison has identified a GoFundMe that's currently running. Help Basma support the elderly and those with special needs. We'll share more information about this on our Instagram and elsewhere. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.